for the summer. We're going to tackle chapter 13 and 14 today, so that should be fascinating. Will be for me anyway. We're going to talk about physical health and mental health. But first, we're going to talk about physical health. Here we go. There we are. Physical health. Genetic variability in humans is considerably less than in many other species, given how recently modern humans emerged as a species. Modern humans first emerged approximately 200,000 years ago, and they all lived in Africa until approximately 50 to 60,000 years ago, when some of them migrated elsewhere. Now, oddly enough, they have recently discovered human hominid um, fossils that were in China that were 140,000 years old. So these are not absolutes. This is just what we've seen so far. So it's possible that humanity has been around the world for longer than 200,000 years. Well, modern humans anyway, for longer than 200,000 years, and the 50 to 60,000 point is just what we have discovered thus far. So should be interesting to watch. They thought that they looked like Neanderthals, the individuals that the hominids that they found in China. But we're still waiting to get better results. And as you can see, if you look at all the humans from around the world, we all look pretty much the same. Oddly enough, the main differences are skin tone, and the skin tone's not that much different. Um, anyway, yeah, all lots of different differences. Humans have become so dependent on cultural information to survive that culture has become a selective force on their biological nature. Humans are said to be a product of culture, gene coevolution, as they have both evolved biological predispositions to depend on cultural information, and this cultural information enhances their fitness as it continues to evolve. A common domain in which we see evidence for this selection is cultural differences in dietary practices, such as milk consumption. Different cultures vary in what they regularly eat, and long-term persistent changes in dietary practices have been accompanied by genetic evolution that maximizes the effectiveness of the nutrition that people derive from their diets. And a good example is dairy. Cows, of course, come from Europe. So people from Asia did not evolve consuming dairy. And for that reason, people who have Asian ancestry, we can say, I guess, some of them have problems digesting dairy products. And of course, it causes lower intestinal distress, also causes hives. Humans vary in the amount of starch they eat. In general, people in agricultural societies consume more starch than those in most foraging societies. How do we think about this? If we're talking about a foraging society, we're talking about individuals that potentially are moving around a lot. So they can't plant crops. Since they can't plant crops, they eat a lot of meat. They're looking for fruit. They eat fruits that they can find in trees. They'll eat nuts. They're foragers. And sometimes they can find tubers, but people in agricultural societies, of course, they eat a lot more starches because they grow their own food primarily. So they eat corn, they eat wheat, they eat rice, but they do eat meat. They just don't eat nearly as much as people who are foragers. People from cultures in which a lot of starch has traditionally been consumed are more likely to have a genetic mutation that increases the amount of amylase protein in their saliva, which helps to digest starch. Now, this is really kind of interesting because, as we know, Europeans started growing their own food thousands and thousands of years ago, and for that reason, it may be that Europeans have more of this amylase protein in their saliva than people that were hunter-gatherers. In West Africa, populations of Kwa-speaking farmers started to grow yam crops, which required them to clear the forests. One inadvertent side effect of this cultural practice was that it increased the amount of standing water after a rain, creating a better habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria then spread in these regions and led to the evolution of a particular genetic variant for hemoglobin that is associated with sickle cell anemia, which has the benefit of making one more resistant to developing malaria. So what happened was the Kwa-speaking farmers came in, they cleared a lot of the underbrush and the forest. And because of that, there was more standing water. Because there was more standing water, the mosquitoes were able to breed and evolve. And that's where malaria came from the bite of the Anopheles mosquito. Researchers around the world have attempted to identify different genetic variables that might lead to social sensitivity. 5-HTTLPR, A118G, and MAOA are alleles that have been found in Asian samples, but not in European samples. Could they have something to do with their social sensitivity? Asians, of course, live in very crowded surroundings, and because of that, they tend to be more collectivistic. So it's easier for them to get along with all the people around them because they have to. A genetic variant that is associated with increased emotional support seeking in times of distress for European Americans is associated with decreased emotional support seeking among Koreans. So we have a similar genetic structure, but we have the opposite happening with European Americans and happening with Koreans. A variant that is associated with increased attention to foreground objects among European Americans shows the opposite effect among Koreans. So once again, we have the same genetic variant and we have a different outcome, a completely opposite outcome. A variant that leads to better responses to antidepressants among Caucasians leads to worse responses among Koreans and Japanese. A variant associated with decreased emotion suppression among European Americans predicted increased emotional expression among Koreans. So while it tempers the way European Americans act, it actually increases the emotional expression among Koreans. Studies that included a sample of Korean Americans who are genetically more similar to Koreans but culturally more similar to European Americans showed a pattern of results that were more similar to those of European Americans, demonstrating that cultural experiences can actually shape how genes are expressed in the body. Dutchmen average 6'1", 3 inches taller than the average American man, who stands at just under 5'10". In 1865, American men averaged 5'8", which was 3 inches taller than the average Dutch man at the time. Things have changed. In the late 19th century, on average, Americans were among the tallest in the world, reflecting their relative advantage in income. Their gross natural product per capita was third highest in the world. At that time, American men stood 1 inch taller than Britons, the same height as Australians, 2 inches taller than Norwegians, 3 inches taller than the French, 4 inches taller than Italians, and more than 7 inches taller than the Japanese. South Korean children are about 5 inches taller than their North Korean counterparts. Japanese immigrants to California in the 1950s were about 5 inches taller than their compatriots in Japan. And they assumed that the reason was because of dairy consumption, in particular, had been linked to the height of the Japanese Americans as compared to the Japanese. And these are Japanese, and these are Japanese Americans, as you can see. And as you can see, they're taller, a lot taller, about 5 inches taller. Japanese and Korean adults report sleeping about an hour less per day than French adults do. Moreover, these cultural differences are not just evident among adults. A systematic study of infants and toddlers in 17 countries around the world found that Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Infants from Asian countries were found to sleep much less than infants from Western countries. Dutch infants were found to sleep about 1.3 hours more than American infants. People in the countries at the extreme of the sleep spectrum, Japan and the Netherlands, have a pronounced difference in the amount that they sleep. Japanese, European Canadians, and Asian Canadians were provided biometric measurements to measure their sleep. Japanese participants slept about 1.2 hours less than the two Canadian samples. Asian Canadians slept similarly to European Canadians, showing that it is actually cultural. And of course, he's making fun. He's a European, a gaijin in Japan, and the women around him are asleep. And he's acting like he's put them to sleep. Japanese participants indicated that their ideal amount of sleep was about an hour less than that reported by Canadians. The Canadians described themselves as feeling more tired during the day, even though they were sleeping more than the Japanese. Until recently, socioeconomic status was invisible to health researchers. Research in 1984 of English civil servants were divided into 4 class categories. The researchers found that compared with top administrators, members of the executive class were 60% more likely to die over the 10-year period. The clerical staff was 120% more likely to die, and the unskilled laborers were 170% more likely to die. Despite the fact that these are very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. It is actually larger than smokers and non-smokers. So what are we talking about? It all depends on how much money you have, and it all depends on what kind of a job you have. So if you're an administrator that sits and tells people what to do all day, you are going to live longer than somebody who has to is lower than you on the hierarchy. Somebody that has to take your advice as to what they need to do next. Who's going to live longer than the people that are actually doing the work, and the people that are doing the unskilled labor? They even die younger, as weird as that may seem. The same thing was observed in Denmark. They looked at the same civil servants. Same thing was found in Denmark. Same thing was found in Norway. The same thing was found in Finland. The same thing was found in France. The same thing was found in Japan. The same thing was found in New Zealand. In the United States, almost every increase in income reduces mortality rates, and these differences emerge even among those incomes at the highest level. So if you've got $1 billion, then you're going to live longer than somebody with $400 million. If you have $2 billion, you're going to live longer than that guy with $1 billion. And there we go, as death rates by income. The Fulani, Mosi, and Ramabe all live in northeast Burkina Faso, and this is where Burkina Faso is. The region is endemic with malaria, which is a major cause of death in the area. The Mosi and Ramabe have been living in this region for thousands of years and have developed much genetic resistance to malaria over time. The Fulani moved to this region in the early 19th century as a part of the Islamic invasion of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fulani have not developed much genetic resistance to malaria. The Fulani are the dominant ethnic group in this area. When the Fulani first arrived, they conquered, enslaved, and decultured the other ethnic groups in the area, including the Mosi and the Ramabe. The higher status that they have as conquerors appears to provide them with enough health benefits to more than make up for their genetic vulnerability to malaria. Your health may be seriously compromised if you don't have enough money to pay for adequate health care. In the British civil servant study, all of the workers had the same access to state-provided health care, yet there were still pronounced differences. People lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to have jobs that place them in hazardous situations, such as having to deal with poisonous toxins that make them vulnerable to workplace accidents. People in the lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to smoke, eat a poor diet, and are less likely to exercise. Chronically stressed people are more likely to engage in health-compromising behaviors, such as smoking and drinking, in order to cope with the difficulties in their lives, and stress directly weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infections and manage other threats. People who feel that they do not have much control in their jobs tend to have a higher risk of heart disease. Low levels of control are more generally associated with poor physical functioning and increased likelihood of illness. One study by Lockman and Weaver in 1998 found that although lower socioeconomic status people have worse health outcomes, those with lower socioeconomic status who felt that they had much control in their lives had levels of health and well-being that were comparable to those in higher income groups. In other words, the more control you feel, the less likely you are to have health problems. Stress and feelings of a lack of control tend to be more pronounced among those who occupy a subordinate position and are subject to the demands of those who are able to make decisions for themselves. This is not just true of humans. Research with various primates has revealed that those individuals who are subordinate in a hierarchy experience greater stress hormone levels when the society is ruled by intimidation. Now, this has a lot to do with bullying as well. So, somebody that is a victim of bullying, they will have more health problems than someone that isn't being bullied. The high stress hormones are especially true when subordinate primates are unable to easily avoid dominant individuals and when they have low availability of social support. The societal features that result in the greatest degree of stress among subordinates in various primate populations are remarkably similar to the situation in which many low socioeconomic people find themselves in modernized, industrialized societies. Well, wait a minute. Let me go back just for a second. Now, one of the things that we had discovered from Vietnam was this very thing. The people that had no control over anything that happened to them, the ones that were the most subordinate, the lowest ranking individuals, the individuals that were not NCOs, the individuals that were not officers, had no decision-making process, were just thrown out there and had to do what everybody else was telling them. They were the ones that suffered PTSD more than anybody else. And of course, with further studies, we find that control has a lot to do with health outcomes. It has a lot. Socioeconomic status has a lot to do with all of this type of information. Feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. The experience of relative deprivation, of knowing that others are doing better than you, might lead to stress and its associated negative health consequences. Now, the reason I have this picture is because these are women at a polo match, and a lot of times what will happen is somebody will have a girlfriend and they'll bring them to a polo match. Well, if you've ever been in horse country, well, you've never been in horse country in Virginia. There's a lot of very wealthy people there. Now, the odd thing is that you'll see these people wandering around, and well, this has a lot to do with what I was just talking about with the billionaire. If somebody only has $400,000, let's say she only has $400,000, and she comes from a family with 800, I'm sorry, $400 million, and this person comes from a family with $800 million. Guess which one of them is going to get sick? Well, not the one with $800 million, because she runs around with the lady whose family only has $400 million. So she has a Bentley and she only has a Mercedes. And because of that, this person feels deprived. As weird as that sounds. So it's the people that you hang around with that tell you whether you're doing okay or not. There's a clear relation between the absolute wealth of a nation and the average life expectancy of its citizens. This is true up to a gross domestic product per capita figure of approximately $30,000 per year. Above the per capita GDP of $30,000, the curve largely flattens out, suggesting very little relation between absolute wealth and life expectancy. Many of the countries in the flat part of the curve have average incomes that are lower than that of the lowest Americans, yet these people don't seem to have to be worse off in terms of health outcomes. Poor Americans are doing far worse than wealthier Americans. Income and health is actually a relationship between health and one's income relative to those around you. So it all depends on where you are. If you live in New York City, where you've got to have $100,000 a year, or you can't find any place to live, then then the people around you who are making $200,000 and $400,000 a year, those are the individuals that you're hanging around with. So you'll have more health problems than they will. Indians living in the poor province of Kerala have far lower absolute incomes than poor African Americans in the United States. However, people in Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree. The Keralians are poor in absolute terms, but they likely feel less poor because nearly everyone around them is poor, so they don't feel poor at all. It all depends on the people that you're around. Poor Americans often earn an income that is not that poor by international standards. However, they are poor compared to their fellow Americans, and their health suffers accordingly. Disadvantaged minorities around the world tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, and they often experience worse health outcomes than those of majority members. In particular, African Americans in the United States suffer from relatively worse health outcomes. Looking at 15 leading causes of death in the United States, African Americans have higher death rates than that of European Americans for 12 of them. The African Americans tend to be of much lower socioeconomic status than European Americans. Many of the reasons for their higher mortality can likely be explained by the socioeconomic status difference. And the three that European Americans have a higher rate is respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's disease, and suicide. And as we know, European Americans are just a skosh below American Indians when it comes to suicide, but they are the 1 and 2. Whites and American Indians have the highest suicide rate in the United States. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease, suicide, and respiratory disease. Whoops, sorry. Infant mortality rates among African Americans are about double that of European Americans, and these differences also hold for those African Americans who are highly educated. And as we can see, here's the infant mortality rate for African Americans. Here's the infant mortality rate for American Indian Alaska Natives. Here's white people, 5.7, 13.7. and Asian Pacific Islanders are the lowest. Hypertension is especially high among African American men, and unlike other health outcomes, hypertension rates are slightly higher for African American men with college degrees than they are for African American men with less education. The opposite holds true for African American women and for European American men and women. So the only people that have a problem with education are African American males with a lot of education, which means that probably Barack Obama suffers from high blood pressure. I went to college with a number of African American males, and about, let's see, what is it? About half of all the white people that I went to college with are still alive. There were, and only about 10% of the African Americans are still alive, and I'm 72 years old, so only 10%. There's only two African Americans that are still alive. There were about 20 in my class. Compared to European Americans, Latinos tend to have a lower mortality rate for 10 of the 15 leading causes of death. This ethnic difference is all the more puzzling because Latinos tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than European Americans and hence should be expected to suffer worse health outcomes. And this is known as the epidemiological paradox. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. The epidemiological paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans, and there are no explanations as to why. Latinos tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latinos, although they also tend to exercise less. The longer they have lived in the United States, the more likely they are to engage in unhealthy behaviors as they come to drink more, smoke more, and are more likely to become obese. Some cultural factors are more pronounced among Latinos, such as the high value placed on childbearing and a good deal of emotional support provided by the community seem to provide an important health buffer. Latinos derive health benefits from cultural scripts, such as simpatica, and their unusually high levels of positive effect. In traditional non-Western societies, beliefs in the supernatural causes of illness are widespread. These range from theories that aggressive spirits such as ghosts cause disease, which is the most widespread theory of disease, to accounts of witchcraft, sorcery, mystical retributions, and sinful violations of taboos. Among the Azande of West Africa, the primary cause of illness is attributed to witchcraft. Some Zande are believed to be witches, and the source of their witchcraft is believed to be a small organ in their bodies, which can be inherited from their parents. Now, this is an Azande woman, and I want you to look at her eyes. Look into her eyes. The Zande witches do not perform any rites, use any potions, or cast any spells. Rather, witches conduct their witchcraft entirely through their minds. And here's another Zande woman. A little spooky, isn't it? When a Zande develops a slowly progressing illness, it is believed to be the result of a witch who is consuming the soul of its victim's organs a little bit at a time. When a Zande develops a sudden acute illness, it is believed to be the result of a sorcerer casting a spell on them. In traditional Chinese medicine, a healthy body is one in which the dialectical forces of yin and yang are in balance. Any imbalances are believed to be ultimately lead to illness. Yin and yang. Yin is the male and yang is the female, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't remember. A person who has liver fire will have symptoms such as headaches, flushed face, and anger, and this illness is believed to be caused by having too much yang and not enough yin. No, yang is the male and yin is the female. Such an imbalance can be corrected by acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle. Western doctors often disagree with one another. There are rather striking differences between medical practices of French and American doctors. The French believe in a concept of terrain or balance. This emphasis on balance shifts drug consumption away from antibiotics and toward various tonics and vitamins that are believed to strengthen the immune system. Long rests and spa visits are also viewed as an important part of the lifestyle that rejuvenates the terrain. Hospital stays are relatively long in France, about double the length in the United States, for the same procedures, to provide ample time for recuperation. And as you can see, we have a clown at the hospital. Now, this is really kind of interesting. When I was living in Germany, we had these kinds of blinds, and these are called Rouladen. The odd thing is that Rouladens will block out the light. They really block out the light. You roll them down, and that's why they're called Rouladen. But they're also bulletproof, which is kind of curious, or can be bulletproof. French hospitals are notorious for employing clowns to raise the spirits of their patients. This is an ancient practice dating back to the ancient Greeks. French clowns are especially common in pediatric wings. As you can see, they are well received. And what did we see back here? When Europeans first came to the Americas, the natives often commented on how badly they smelled. This is because the common medical practice in the 17th century in France stated that bodily secretions offered a layer of protection, so it was considered unhealthy to bathe frequently. And the French still do that to this day. In a 1976 article in Le Monde, which is a Paris magazine, stated that the French hospital patient had the right to a monthly bath and to weekly foot washings. French dermatologists recommend that people, even those with oily hair, not wash their hair more than once a week because doing so causes a greater amount of oil to be secreted. The metaphor used in the United States by doctors is that the body is like a machine that needs to be tended to regularly to ensure that it is running well. When there are problems with the body, it is often treated in ways that you might expect to see a machine repaired. U.S. medicine is known as the most aggressive in the world. Surgical procedures are used far more in the United States than in other countries where malfunctioning parts are removed, replaced, and or physically altered. U.S. doctors are more likely than European doctors to use surgery rather than drugs. But when drugs are prescribed in the United States, they're prescribed at higher dosages than any other country. It is rare in the United States for a doctor to prescribe rest and relaxation as a curative agent. U.S. doctors tend to search for an external cause of illness, such as bacteria and viruses. U.S. doctors prescribe more antibiotics than doctors from elsewhere, and Americans tend to have a greater concern for cleanliness and attempt to avoid contact with germs. And that is the end of chapter 13. So let's jump into chapter 14. Oh, there we go. Chapter 14. And this may be the cover of your book. That's a third edition. Probably not. I think there's another one. Mine is different than this. I must be in the fourth edition. Psychological disorders are defined as rare behaviors that somehow impair the individual. The problem: what type of impairment is problematic, and what if a behavior that is rare in one context is not rare in another? Indeed, some psychopathologies are more prevalent or manifest in highly different forms across cultures. Experiencing a culture-bound syndrome generally requires one to have cultural beliefs associated with the syndrome. DOT is a morbid anxiety seen most frequently among South Asian males that they are losing or leaking semen. and it is believed that loss of sperm results in the person getting seriously ill. This often results from anxieties about disapproved sexual acts, such as masturbation. And that's in South Asia. South Asia is primarily India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Laos. That's Southeast Asia. This dot would be a meaningless label in the United States, however, where there are no cultural beliefs about the vitality that sperm endows, and no cultural beliefs about the consequences of loss of sperm. Is it possible that other cultures suffer from the same psychological disorders as the West, but don't have the same cultural beliefs associated with Western diagnoses, making them meaningless in other cultural contexts? And that's a possibility. The reality is that all humans react exactly the same to every situation. It's the culture that tells you if there's a problem. Hikikomori is a condition in Japan characterized by living in an asocial state with no intimate relationships with anyone outside of the immediate family. Now, if you think about your high school days and you think about all the people that you were around in high school, you probably had any number of people that acted like this. That they weren't all that social. They didn't go to dances. They sat in the back of the room. They didn't interact with anybody else, and nobody really cared. But in Japan, where it's so crowded, and in Japan, where everybody is jammed together almost continually, something like this is very strange. It first appears in junior high, and they end up reading books, watching TV, or playing games in their rooms. How horrible, reading books, watching TV, or playing games in their room. I may have hikikomori. Uh, Indications are that the cause may be failure to succeed in a social world that has few options for those who don't fit in. Does not conform to criteria for any of the DSM-5 diagnoses. It has only recently become a cultural phenomenon and is now seen, although rarely, in other East Asian countries. Hikikomori. Approximately one child per classroom in junior high and high school is afflicted with hikikomori, largely non-existent in pre-war Japan and uncommon in other cultures. And as you can see, their room is very cluttered with the things that they collect. Hikikomori. Bulimia nervosa is uncontrollable binge eating. Individual then takes inappropriate measures to prevent the weight gain, like throwing up or exercising. It's absent in most cultures of the world, making it a culture-bound syndrome, especially in cultures where food is not abundant, of course. A lot of people are bulimic. Well, they don't throw up, that's for sure. Eating disorders affect many people in the West, but there are some nuances when it comes to determining universality of these conditions. Bulimia appears to be a culture-bound syndrome because rates have increased over time, and the age of people being diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. It is also more prevalent in some societies, particularly those with Western influences, than others. In particular, it is absent in most cultures of the world, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. There is good evidence that bulimia is a culture-bound syndrome. Anorexia nervosa, an individual's refusal to maintain normal body weight due to preoccupation with their body. Evidence of culture-bound status, a huge increase in rates of anorexia this century, primarily found in only some cultures. Evidence of universality, reports of self-starvation in numerous cultural contexts, but not due to body image. As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. However, it has been found in cultures that have very little Western influence, and it also manifests differently in some other contexts as well. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted among ascetics who refused food for religious reasons, and in the 17th and 18th century among teenage girls who starved themselves to model themselves after the ascetics. This historical record of anorexia, as well as evidence of anorexia in many non-Western contexts, have led some to argue that it is a universal disorder, although it may serve different functions in different places. For example, religious reasons versus weight loss reasons. And this is Mahatma Gandhi. He would go on starvation diets from time to time to get people to do what he wanted them to do. The other thing that he did, which was a little weird, he would sleep beside a an attractive female. He would sleep beside her and he wouldn't have sex with her. And the reason he did that was for self-control. He was practicing self-control. Koro is a morbid anxiety about one's penis shrinking into one's body, primarily found in South and East Asia. It is unclear what aspects of culture have led to the emergence of Koro. Koro-like symptoms have been found in some individuals in West African cultures, as well as individuals in American culture who have had negative marijuana-induced experiences. Amok is an acute outburst of unrestrained violent and homicidal attacks preceded by brooding, followed by exhaustion and amnesia. Most common in Southeast Asia, it may result from having no acceptable means to express your frustration. Hysteria is a commonly diagnosed condition in the 19th century in Europe among women. Symptoms include temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite for food and sex. Rates of hysteria diagnosis dropped dramatically in the early 20th century. Some think it is due to its being replaced by other diagnostic categories, while others think that it was associated with repressive Victorian cultural norms. And most of the repressive Victorian cultural norms had to do with sex. So there was a lot of guilt involved, and that's where they think hysteria came from. So if you read Freud, you read a lot about hysteria, and it may have been because that was the Victorian era that he came up with his concepts of psychoanalysis. So there you go. Phrygophobia is morbid fear of catching cold. It's found largely in China. People avoid cold air, eating cold food, dress with several layers. This disorder has been linked to other psychological disorders such as hypochondriasis and obsessive compulsive disorder. Phrygophobia. Phrygophobia may be culturally linked to Koro, where the disorder causes male sufferers to feel that their penis is retracting into the body due to an insufficiency of male element or yang. Male phrygophobia sufferers correlate coldness with an overabundance of the female element or yin. Susto is a frightening condition in which a person thinks their soul has been caused to become dislodged from their body, causing a variety of physical and psychological symptoms. It's primarily found in Latin America. Susto. Voodoo death. Person is convinced a curse has been placed on him or she has broken a taboo. Results in severe fear reaction, which may lead to death. It's mostly found in Africa. Lata is a transient dissociated state brought on by a startling event followed by engaging in cultural inappropriate behavior, after which the person has no memory of the episode. It's found primarily in Southeast Asia, but also in Siberia and amongst the Ainu in Japan. Mulgry is a concern that one has been invaded by a totemic spirit that makes them sick, tired, and drowsy because they entered the sea or a new territory without having engaged in the appropriate ceremonial rituals. It's identified among Aboriginal Australians, So yeah, gotta be careful when you go in for a swim. Agonias is an anxiety disorder that includes a burning sensation, loss of breath, and sleeping, among other symptoms. It's primarily found in Portugal and the Azores. And Azores, of course, is off the coast of Africa. The Azores are islands off the coast of Africa that are owned by Portugal. Kufungisisa, Kufungisisa, Kufungisisa is anxiety and somatic problems associated with mental exhaustion stemming from too much thinking, primarily found in Africa, Caribbean, and among select Native Americans and East Asians. So it's from thinking too much. Ataques des nervois, feeling palpitations, numbness, and a rising heat sensation during emotionally charged situations such as funerals. It has been found in Puerto Rico. Attack of the nerves. Universal syndromes highlight the biological bases of these psychopathologies. Still, prevalence and manifestations of these disorders may differ across cultures. The DSM-5 major depressive disorder, MDD, diagnosed given 5 of the following 9 symptoms: depressed mood, inability to feel pleasure, change in weight or appetite, sleep problems. And when I say change in weight or appetite, it means gaining weight or losing weight, not staying the same. Sleep problems, psychomotor change, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless or guilty, poor concentration, and suicidality. 5 of those. MDD has been found in all cultures that people have studied. Prevalence rates appear to vary. Depression prevalence rates vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. The rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the West. So they don't have nearly the depression that we have in the United States. One proposed rationale for this is due to 2 different manifestations of symptoms. Somatization. Symptoms are primarily physiological, such as loss of appetite, and psychologization. Symptoms are primarily psychological, such as depressed mood. Now, it's where you put your emphasis. If you put it on somatization, then you expect people to have a physiological reaction to it. And if it's psychologization, that's just a depressed mood. Okay, so in China, where they look for somatization, diagnosed much more infrequently than in the United States. All you have to do is feel a little depressed. Many Chinese psychiatric patients are diagnosed with something that we don't even have anymore. It's called neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, and the inability to concentrate. Neurasthenia was dropped from the DSM series because symptoms were more physiological than psychological. Some have argued that most Chinese neurasthenia actually qualify for depression, even if only 9% of them report feeling depressed. Gets a little confusing, doesn't it? Social anxiety disorder is a fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, leading to negative social consequences. Research has shown that East Asians exhibit more social anxiety symptoms than European Americans. Accordingly, evidence suggests that interdependence is associated with heightened social anxiety. However, social anxiety is less documented in East Asian countries. It has been documented universally, but counterintuitively, it is less documented in East Asian countries than in North American countries, despite greater concerns about social harmony and maintaining faith in East Asia. Certainly, East Asians exhibit greater social anxiety symptoms, and there is some link between interdependence and social anxiety symptoms. In general, though, the rates of social anxiety disorder in North America and in Europe are 14 times higher than rates in East Asia. The paradox between East Asians experiencing more symptoms but not meeting clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder may be due to differences in what behaviors are considered culturally normative. In Western cultures, the norm is for people to be extroverted. In East Asian cultures, the norm is for people to be introverted. That's not to say that social anxieties do not become a problem in East Asian cultures. There is a culture-bound disorder called Taijin Kayufushu, or a fear of confronting others. It is a fear that is solicited by social situations, such that one is concerned about how uncomfortable one makes other people feel, perhaps because of their gaze, your body odor, or your sweating. It is similar to social anxiety disorder because it is effectively treated using the same antidepressant as is used to treat social anxiety disorder. It has thus far been limited to Japan, China, and South Korea. Taijin Koyufushu. Suicide rates vary dramatically around the world. Eastern Europe tends to have the highest rates. Muslim nations tend to have the lowest. Suicide rates also vary depending on one's age, with the elderly generally being more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. There is a special case in Micronesia in which there is a spike in the adolescent age group. This started primarily in the 1970s when a spate of suicides occurred among adolescent men over seemingly trivial problems with no obvious psychological issues to begin with. These suicides also restricted to specific islands, particularly the suburban regions of these islands. Some have suggested that this spike was due to westernization of the island, leading to a loss of traditional roles for young men. Suicide rates. Here's Micronesia, is this one right here. There you go. Okay. This is Hungary. East Asia, it's an East Asian country. Okay, the United States is the orange. As you can see, our suicide rates are pretty low. And then Japan. Here's Egypt, of course. Muslim country, no suicides. Losing connection between one's cultural narrative and modern society, a lack of cultural continuity, seems to put people at risk for suicide. Many First Nation bands do not have a strong sense of cultural continuity due to Western colonization. Many youths cannot identify with their traditional culture and are also unable to identify with mainstream Canadian culture. Support for this argument has come from findings that bands with stable connections to traditional cultural past have lower suicide rates. Such a connection is indicated by negotiating a land claim with the government, possessing self-government, maintaining control over educational services, controlling their police and fire services, managing health services, and cultural facilities. The more these indicators are present, the lower the suicide rate. And of course, this is what I did my research on, suicide and resilience levels. One of the things I discovered looking at resilience was the higher resilience level. There is a higher resilience level with the people that are more culturally aware. And that, of course, can combat suicidal ideations. One fundamental hypothesis that researchers have found support for is that the lack of connection to one's cultural roots is a strong predictor of suicide rates. This is compounded by the fact that many do not identify with mainstream Canadian culture. Indeed, researchers found that the more that First Nations communities can connect with their cultural history, the lower their suicide rates are. The communities that have the most number of connections have suicide rates that are comparable with those of mainstream Canada. These connections include having its own policing or law enforcement organization, cultural facilities that promote a community's cultural history, having one's own political body, and whether or not a community is negotiating a claim to territorial land. Despite the universal prevalence of suicides, prevalence rates still differ dramatically across cultures. Motivations for suicide also vary greatly across cultures. Motivations in the West usually include substance abuse or depression. Motivations in Japan often deal with one accepting responsibility and or preserving honor. The cases of the First Nations in Micronesia suggest that different cultures have different motivations for suicide, and it may carry different meanings in different cultures. For instance, Japan has a long history of suicide playing an unusually significant role with the ritualized suicide method of seppuku. Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating mental disorders and universally found around the world. There are relevant genetic factors, prenatal experiences, and neuroanatomical features. Diagnosed given by two or more of the following. Schizophrenia is one of the most delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, negative symptoms, catatonic behavior, and that is, you need two of those. Schizophrenia is a disorder that is diagnosed when one exhibits two or more of these symptoms. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, catatonic or grossly disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms such as flat affect or loss of speech. There's good evidence of a genetic component for schizophrenia. One's likelihood of developing schizophrenia increases as the degree of genetic relatedness with someone who has schizophrenia increases. Despite its biological basis and a similar incidence rate across cultures, some cultural variation still exists. That is, only 1% of general population will develop schizophrenia. Having a cousin with the disorder leads to a likelihood of 2%. Having a sibling with schizophrenia increases the likelihood to 9%. Having an identical twin increases the likelihood to 48%. As one would expect with something that has a biological basis, incidence and prevalence rates are quite similar across different cultures. But notice that, despite the role of genetics, there is still more than a 50% chance that someone would not develop schizophrenia even if their identical twin with whom one shares 100% of their genes has schizophrenia. Subtypes of schizophrenia vary substantially. In the West, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia as high as 75% of all the people with schizophrenia have paranoid schizophrenia. The rate of catatonic schizophrenia is 1 to 3%. In India, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is as high as 15% as compared to 75% in the West, and the rate of catatonic schizophrenia is 20%. Also, patients in less developed societies have greater rate of recovery than in more industrialized societies. This is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental pathologies. The cause of this difference is unknown. Some suggest that patients are more likely to remain members of a community in such societies rather than becoming homeless in industrialized societies. Interestingly, patients in less developed societies have greater rates of recovery from schizophrenia than in more industrialized societies, which is the opposite. Explanations for this counterintuitive pattern include laying less blame on the patient due to his or her having less of a primary sense of control, having more positive associations with what the West considers to be hallucinations, and greater involvement of the community so that the person does not get left alone. Just as presentation and prevalence of psychological disorders vary across cultures, the same goes for how the disorders are treated. There is a tradition in the West of patients seeing a therapist and verbalizing their feelings and problems. likely rooted in the Western emphasis on self-expression and being in a low-context culture, among many other ideas discussed in this course. There is cultural variation in coping and seeking support. East Asians are less likely than European Americans to actively seek social support. This is due to concerns about how this will disrupt relationships with others. Instead, they rely on implicit social support, reminding themselves of the close relationships that they have. This may explain why East Asians tend to seek professional mental health treatments less than Westerners. Western treatment traditions can be traced back to Freudian times. Psychological problems are best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences. As treatment has extended into modern times, there is an emphasis on understanding the individual, his or her self-discovery, and his or her cognitive biases. Freud thought that psychological problems were best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences because such problems were believed to be rooted in people's conflicts at an unconscious level, and the therapist should then interpret those experiences and memories. Carl Rogers then introduced the client-centered approach, and other biological modes of thought have since been developed as well. But the common thread running through all the different therapy options is the client's ability to engage with the therapist. In contrast to Western style, two broad categories of treatments can be seen elsewhere. Family-centered, families seen as a key source of guidance and play an important role in treatment, and spiritualism and religion, construing psychological disorders as a problem with one's spirituality or a relationship with God or gods that went awry. In other cultures, healing practices are performed very differently. One of the most common practices is the role of families. They share the problems with the individual and also share the stigma and blame associated with whatever mental illness the individual has. Another common practice involves spiritualism and religion, which incorporates traditional healers such as shamans and sorcerers. Japan also has a couple of unique approaches to psychotherapy that reflects the cultural inclinations of Japan. The two are called Morita therapy and Niken therapy. Morita therapy is used to treat depression and anxiety symptoms. It does so by emphasizing secondary control, asking clients to accept the circumstances of their lives. Clients must change their perspectives of the symptoms and learn to live productively in spite of those symptoms. To live productive lives, the treatment plan involves light manual activities such as sweeping, heavy manual labor such as chopping wood, and other forms of life training. Nikon therapy is used to treat people with depression and addiction problems. Clients are asked to reflect on their past, particularly on the kindnesses that they have received from others, while thinking about how little they have offered in return for those kindnesses. Given the cultural diversity and prevalence rates of psychopathologies, one concern that has been raised is whether Western mental health treatments may sometimes do more harm than good. For instance, it's been argued that anorexia did not exist in the same form in Hong Kong until it was imported there. Similarly, post-traumatic stress disorder was not a big problem in Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami until Western aid workers insisted that they must be suffering from it. And that is the end of the chapter. That is the end of the semester. I will see you guys next semester.